This session is called Beer Drinking Music and the New Perfection. The beer drinking music part refers to honky tonk music. Another name for that was beer drinking music. And we'll talk about this idea of a music that's associated with bars and to a certain extent with infidelity and with the nightlife and so on. And then the new perfection refers to the Nashville sound and really recording technology, studio approaches, and so on. So those are the two things we're going to talk about in this session. This is a follow-up from the last session where we were talking about bluegrass music and crooners, and so in a way that it was a nice balance because we had the less authentic crooners, the more polished sound of the crooners, both vocal sound and the production sound, the poppier sound. And then, of course, beer drinking music, or bluegrass was the more neo-traditionalist sound, the more rural sound, even though, as we saw, it's actually quite modern sounding in a lot of ways, but drawing on the ideology of tradition. And this session provides us with another similar dichotomy. On the one hand, you have honky tonk music, which puts forward its own sense of authenticity. This idea of being tied to the underbelly of urban life, of alcoholism, infidelity, the idea of wage slavery, just the idea of the lack of freedom of modern man. All those things get addressed in honky tonk music. So there's this new conception of authentic expression, and this idea of country music speaking a kind of truth, of it telling the truth of the people. A lot of that ideology is bound up in honky tonk music, especially with Hank Williams, and we'll talk about him in a bit. Whereas the Nashville sound is like I call it here, the new perfection, because it's this approach to recording technology and the sort of pristine level of recording technology. And we'll see that Chet Atkins is a major part of that. This approach where everything is in its place and there's a place for each thing and everything is just right? Everything's tweaked just right. So on the one hand, honky tonk music, a little more rough and tumble, a little less about polish. Nashville is all about polish, the Nashville sound. So that's our topic for today. So honky tonk music, also called hard country or beer drinking music. And as you know, this idea of hard country or outlaw country, this continues on through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and really has a sort of resurgence of interest in the 70s with outlaw country. It was influenced, obviously, by Jimmie Rodgers' singing style, but also by the Bob Wills approach to Western swing, right? This approach to arranging, the use of drums, the use of electric instruments, that slide guitar from Western swing, that all of that gets brought into honky tonk music. So it arose in the honky tonks, which are basically just bars, right? A honky tonk is usually a not particularly lovely bar, a somewhat seedy bar, that are near oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma. So again, just like Western swing was based basically in Texas, Oklahoma, and California, honky tonk music is primarily, at least at first, coming out of Texas and Oklahoma. The song topics are moving away from the religious and from the sort of everyday and from the romance, right? We've seen the religious topics in the Carter family and the sort of lost love topics in the Carter family. With Jimmie Rodgers, we saw some ideas of the rambling young man, hero, unreliable to some extent. And then, of course, with the Western swing, it was about dancing and again, romance, of course, and more or less happy romance. With the country crooners, it was all about romance and the longing of romance, right? Or kind of nostalgia, too. Patti Page's Tennessee Waltz, of course. With honky tonk music, we're moving away from those topics toward really topics that are more of the modern day. Domestic instability. Marriages where people just can't get along, the difficulty of love relationships, that no matter how close you feel you are to someone else, there's always a divide, always a distance, seeming unbridgeable chasm, alcoholism, the brevity of life, the idea that we live for a while and then die too soon. And of course, the need for enjoyment, even if that's questionable enjoyment, and even if it's just grabbing the moment for anything that you can strangle out of it. So this is much more directly emotional music. It emphasizes breaks in the voice. Remember we talked last time about Bill Monroe and the high lonesome sound. And he had some breaks in the voice, of course, when you're pushing the higher register of your voice like that. But here we're really emphasizing those breaks as a sign of emotionality, as this kind of indicator of a place where the production of sound in the voice gives way to something that's percussive and purely musical, where sense gives way to feeling. There are a lot of melismas in this music, right? And then the use of blue notes, of course. But unlike bluegrass, in honky tonk music, you have electric guitars, steel guitars, an amplified fiddle, bass, and piano, and sometimes you even have drums, right? And remember that the Grand Ole Opry more or less outlaws drums, and so this is a kind of radical alternative to the mainstream of country music. So one of the first important honky tonk artists is this man, Ernest Tubb. He got his contract with RCA through the help of Jimmy Rogers' widow. He basically wrote her a piece of fan mail in 1936, asking for an autographed photo of Jimmy Rogers. And she was so impressed with how much he knew about her husband and how eloquently he wrote about some of the songs that influenced him that she became interested in helping this young singer. And so she helped get him a contract with RCA. His first two records were unsuccessful. They didn't do very well. But in 1939, he had a tonsillectomy, and that changed his singing style. He got a little higher and more breaks in the voice and so on. And in 1940, he signs with Decca, so he leaves RCA, signs with Decca, and he's one of the first of these artists to move toward electric instruments. His first hit, Walking the Floor Over You in 1941 on Decca Records, got him a spot on Grand Ole Opry, and that's a song where he's, obviously pacing the floor, worrying about his loved one and whether she truly loves him. And then the more explicit song, 1949's Slipping Around, was the number one country song. And this is the first, it may be at least, the first country song, certainly the first popular country song, to deal with infidelity. And as you know, infidelity becomes a kind of major topic in country music, the idea of one spouse cheating on another. And this song really talks about some of the suspicious nature that one has, even when one is the person slipping around, that they have to be careful and suspicious of being caught and so on. In 1943 to 48, he worked with the guitarist Jimmy Short, whose single line runs are really quite remarkable. So when you listen to the recordings from 43 to 48, you'll hear some pretty interesting guitar work. Jimmy Short is a under-celebrated guitarist, but he's one of those guitarists, along with some others, including some that we'll talk about later today, that incorporate some jazz-inspired lines into country music. And that approach, that jazz-inflected approach to country, it's already been in play to a certain extent with bluegrass, but this brings it to the electric guitar, and it brings a slightly smoother sound with it. Hank Thompson, heavily influenced by Bob Wills, but he discourages the instrumental solos that were really the basis of Wills's approach. In 1952, he has his first number one single with the song The Wild Side of Life, and it spent 15 weeks at number one. This song portrays an unfaithful woman who prefers honky tonks. She prefers going out the bars than to domesticity, to being a good spouse or whatever. And you'll listen to this song for this week, because I also want you to listen to the next song, which is an answer song. And that's on the next slide. And that's Kitty Wells' song. So Kitty Wells is one of the first female stars of this style, of the honky tonk style. Honky tonk, like not all country styles. Obviously, the crooners had plenty of a female presence, and some of the more traditional country music, especially after the Carter family, had a more female presence. But Kitty Wells was one of the first female stars of the honky tonk sound, and really honky tonk catered more toward men's perspectives. So there aren't a whole lot of at least in that first generation of honky tonk performers that are women, and she's one of the few. She's considered the first female superstar of country music, and she really sets the pattern in a way for people like Loretta Lynn and Dolly Parton and so on. And she was heavily featured on the alternative to the Grand Ole Opry, the radio show Louisiana Hayride. Many of her songs deal with betrayal. So instead of like slipping around where he's the one cheating on his wife and he's talking about being worried about slipping around, she's the one suffering the betrayal in a lot of her songs. Her biggest hit was an answer song to Hank Thompson's Wild Side of Life, and she called it "It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels," right? Because this part of the Wild Side of Life is, he says, thank God for honky tonk angels. So in other words, he's benefiting from this woman who is cheating on her husband. So it's, again, a song where the man is experiencing both the dangers of infidelity, but also enjoying the fruits of it, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. And so this song was a response to the Thompson song, the Hank Thompson song, and it's the first. It's not the first, but it's within a line and of these answer songs that become quite popular in the 50s and the 60s, where a famous song gets popular, a song becomes popular that has a certain theme, and then you write a song that either continues to support that or draws on it in some way or answers it directly by contesting it, right? So think about, like, after the Twist came out in the 60s, there were a whole bunch of Twist songs, right, that can be thought of as answer songs in the sense of building. But then there are other songs that are response songs, and this is one of those. So she felt, and probably rightly so, that Hank Thompson's Wild Side of Life was somewhat patronizing toward women. That this woman who is failing her role by not contributing to domesticity or succumbing to domesticity, or however you want to think of it. But of course, the narrator of the song is enjoying her flirtatious presence at the honky tonk. So thank God for honky tonk angels. But Kitty Wells's point here is it's not God who makes people desperate in their marriages. It's not God that drives people to infidelity. It's the marriage itself, right? Or their own irresponsibility, or a whole number of things. But it has nothing to do with God. It has to do with human responsibility. So it's a pretty interesting answer song in that sense. Now, of course, the king of honky tonk music is Hank Williams. As a teenager, Hank Williams won a $15 singing contest by singing WPA Blues. This was an amateur contest held in Montgomery. In Montgomery. Then he's featured on a radio show on WSF as the Singing Kid. So he's quite young at this point, still a teenager. Then he forms his band, the Drifting Cowboys, and you can tell from the title that they're somewhat modeled after the Singing Cowboys, Gene Autry, and so on. But by 1946, he signs to Sterling Records, and then the next year to the newly formed MGM label. So the same, a record label part of the MGM enterprise that also makes films and so on. He becomes a regular on Louisiana Hayride, just like Kitty Wells. And then June 11th, 1949, he's at the Grand Ole Opry, and he sings Lovesick Blues, which becomes a major hit for him. And he winds up having to reprise it several times because the audience keeps calling out to hear it again, right? So this broadcast has him playing the same song several times based on audience demand, and he winds up signing a contract with the Opry that very year. They figure he's the next big thing, and they're right. He is the next big thing. And for a while he's on the Opry all the time, and the Minnie Pearl, who is the comedian on the Grand Ole Opry, she does a stand-up routine on a lot of the broadcasts. She incorporates sort of these flirtatious lines about Hank Williams is a big part of her stand-up routine, and there are skits where she's flirting with him and he can't tell, that kind of thing, you know. So he becomes a major part of the Opry, and of course sings a lot of his hit songs there. But not too long after, in 1952, August of that year, he's fired from the Opry because he's perpetually drunk. He had a pretty serious drinking habit and a pretty serious prescription drug habit. He hurt his back several times, and in dealing with that pain, he became addicted to painkillers and mixed them with alcohol, and becomes a fairly unreliable person in his private life. But he's an inveterate songwriter. Because of his alcohol and addiction problems, he didn't trust himself to drive, and that's a smart thing. So he had a driver, and he'd sit in the back seat, usually drinking, but also writing. And he had notebook after notebook of songs that he would create. Even after he's dead, some people are still recording songs that he never got around to either finishing or recording himself, because he just wrote notebooks full of these songs. He was very, very prolific. One of the greatest, really, songwriters in country music history. The song I'd like you to listen to for this session is I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, which is from 1949. It's a waltz, and it's clearly an evocation of earlier country tradition. But notice the lyrics. There's some intriguing lyrics in it, especially that last line. Sticks out to my mind, but throughout he's talking about these images of nature, and he hears the sound of the whippoorwill, and it makes him so lonesome he could cry. So it's almost like a romantic poem, to a certain extent, like something from Goethe or Wordsworth, where nature is a reflection of one's inner turmoil. Right, and there's the image of the purple sky and the sound of a falling star. That's the line that always sticks out to my mind, because of course there is no sound to a falling star, so it's a contradiction here, and yet there's an element where that stillness that you think of when you think of the falling star, this idea of being alone in the night sky and you see something fall out of place. And of course, stars have long been a symbol of our destiny, of our fate, right? That's why people believe in astrology and all that stuff. And so this idea in the falling star, you wish on the falling star, right? And it's this moment of stillness. And so the sound of the falling star is representing the sound of stillness. And he's so lonesome, he's so alone in that quietness that he could cry. Notice also the exploitation of his accent, right? The way that he exaggerates certain words and the breaks in his voice to communicate emotion. And then also the juxtaposition of the fiddle, which is a much more traditional instrument, with the steel guitar, which is much more modern. And so pay attention to the instrumentation. It's one of those tracks, like I said a long time ago with West End Blues by Louis Armstrong. To me, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry is one of those perfect recordings where everything is just right in its place and everything sounds so intimate that you almost feel like you're there. It doesn't feel like it's just an artifact, and yet it is. It's one of those supreme artifacts. 1951, he releases Hey Good Lookin', which was a crossover hit for him. It wound up on number 29 on the pop charts, which might not seem that high, but that's pretty good for a country crossover that's not a crooner. And of course, it was the number one country song for 8 weeks. It anticipates rockabilly, and it was really influential, along with like a couple of his other songs, like what is that one called? Jambalaya. A couple of his other songs really influenced the rockabilly sound, especially the post-Elvis rockabilly sound, so Buddy Holly and so on. That hiccuping style of Buddy Holly is his version of what Hank Williams does. Notice the lyrics in Hey Good Lookin' anticipate the emphasis on youth and motor cars that will be typical of the early rock and roll era. Then, on the other hand, in opposition, if you wish, to honky tonk music, you have the Nashville sound. And this originates in the mid-50s, and it really replaces honky tonk as the dominant sound of country music. And it features smooth strings and sophisticated arrangements with elaborate background singing. So notice, this is not string band playing. It's not that kind of strings. Fiddles go all the way back to country music, in the history of recorded country music. I'm talking about string sections. I'm talking about orchestral string sections, right? And these sophisticated arrangements of more complex harmonies and approaches to choral singing. So all that stuff from after the AFM band, with these more elaborate choral arrangements, all that gets applied to this Nashville sound. So it was a conscious response to the beginnings of rock and roll and the pop music of the mid-50s, which, cut into country music profits, of course, because rock and roll was the great crossover genre where Elvis and some of the other rock and roll artists really dominated not just the pop charts, but also R&B and country. Elvis, of course, had several hits where he was number one or close to number one on all three charts simultaneously. And that's the kind of feat that not even the Beatles accomplished, right? That was the late 50s was the period of a great deal of crossover success. It was pioneered by the Nashville staff of RCA Victor, Columbia, and Decca. So now there are three. Remember, we saw that Capitol. So now there are four. We saw that Capitol Records was the first major company to establish an office and a studio in Nashville. Now there are four. RCA Victor, Columbia, and Decca, and Capitol are all. They all have major offices and studios there in Nashville. And so Nashville now in the 50s, by the early to mid 50s, really becomes the center of country music in a strong sense. Remember, there's always been a Texas contingent, an Oklahoma contingent, and Atlanta contingent, and so on. But now everything is really starting to be concentrated much more in Nashville. One of the key figures in this development was RCA Victor manager and producer and the incredible guitarist Chet Atkins, right? Sometimes known as Mr. Guitar. And he's an incredible performer, and I'd like you to listen to some of his solo stuff, but he's also very important as a producer, along with a handful of other people like Owen Bradley, Steve Scholes, and Bob Ferguson. And what they really do is they create a sound that's not only influential on country music, but that winds up being readopted by popular music. They're adapting themselves, or they're modeling themselves after some of the pop successes of the mid 50s, both rock and roll and other pop sounds. But they do it in such a clever way. They create such a clever balance, such a sense of sophistication. They really are creating these little gems of recordings that their sound becomes influential again across the various genre divides. One of the signature aspects of that sound is the Nashville A-Team, and here you see several of them, but really it's a whole series of performers. These are studio musicians who played on many country hits of the era. They included Chet Atkins, of course, but also the guitarist Hank Garland. Hank Garland is one of those, again, I think, unsung heroes. Some people know who he is, but a lot of people don't. He was well-versed in both country and jazz. His album, what is it called, Movin', is one of the great guitar jazz albums of that era. His version of All the Things You Are, I've emulated that thing for years, learned every note of it. Fiddler Tommy Jackson, banjoist Earl Scruggs, we've already talked about him, of course. He becomes a studio musician around this time, and the banjoist Sonny Osborne, who is very much in the Scruggs style approach. The pianist Floyd Kramer, amazing country pianist. Again, if you have time, listen to some of his solo country piano stuff. He's really impressive. Then you have these backing singers, including the Jordanaires, who wind up singing back up for people like Elvis Presley as well, especially on his country hits, but not only, also on the rock and roll hits. The Anita Carr singers, who were very famous, and of course the Hardin Trio. So all these very skilled studio singers. The Jordanaires are interesting. They mostly didn't read music, and they mostly came up with their own arrangements right there in the studio. So they would hear the finished product, and they'd sort of, what they said is they were filling in the spaces. They were figuring out what the other instruments weren't doing, and they were trying to fill in those spaces. And some of those arrangements are super sophisticated, super interesting, and some of them are maybe a little bland, but it depends. Then you see a whole bunch of other people here that I didn't list, that are also part of the Nashville A-Team. So these are studio musicians that are just very skilled. They are very comfortable working in the studio, and that's an important thing, because playing in the studio is very different from playing live, right? You don't have that same kind of interaction, but you also don't have the same kind of relationship to your sound. You don't hear yourself in the studio, especially at this time, in the same way as you're going to hear yourself on stage, and you have different kinds of demands being placed on you. And so to be a good studio musician in the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s is to be a sort of special kind of animal, right? And we're going to talk about some really important studio musicians as we move through these decades, and this is one of those examples, the Nashville A-Team. The earliest example of the Nashville sound include things like Ferlin Husky's recording "Gone," which was recorded in November 1956. Jim Reeves, remember we mentioned him as one of the country crooners. He recorded "Four Walls" in February of 57, and that's one of the really great early Nashville sound recordings. And then Don Gibson recorded "Oh Lonely Me," also in 57. That was recorded by Chet Atkins. That's one of his first hits as a producer and arranger. Chet Atkins is really one of the architects of the Nashville sound, but he's also a key innovator on guitar. He took the Travis picking style, which was established by, of course, the great guitarist Merle Travis, where what you're doing is it's kind of an adaptation of country blues style. You have a pick on your thumb, and that gives you a nice heavy bass sound that you're usually alternating walking bass with root fifth kind of motion, and then you also have a kind of strum in between. So this kind of like that ragtime accompaniment almost. And then against that, you have this pretty elaborate counterpoint or set of harmonization. So Merle Travis used 2 fingers, but Atkins uses 3 and sometimes even 4, like a classical guitarist. So he's applying a classical guitar technique to a country sound, including a lot of jazz-inspired licks and jazz-inspired approaches to harmony and so on. So, and including recording some jazz standards and pop standards and so on. He records a version of, for instance, Chinatown, that I would say that would be a great one to listen to, Chinatown, My Chinatown. And he has a recording of Mr. Sandman that was very celebrated. And he just has this way of playing the melody and an accompaniment and sometimes counter melodies and a bass line all at once. And it's really, really something to listen to. He auditioned for Red Foley just as Red Foley was joining the Grand Ole Opry. And Atkins appeared on the Opry in 1946 in Foley's band. He then began recording for Bullet Records with one of his famous early recordings, Guitar Blues, which had a clarinet solo by Dutch McMillan and had Owen Bradley on piano, a very good pianist. But Atkins got fired from many of his gigs because he was considered not country enough. His style was, in a sense, too sophisticated, and the ideal of the late 40s, as you know, was bluegrass, was this more down-home, authentic sound. And the thing is, Atkins could play bluegrass. He wasn't a fabulous bluegrass player in that traditional sense because he was more of a finger-picking player. But he could play bluegrass, but that wasn't really his style. It was so as Merle Travis became more popular, Atkins started to come into vogue, and Atkins really was, even more than Travis, a true virtuoso. He signed with RCA Victor and began recording in Chicago in 47, and then began doing studio work in 49. He joined Maybelle Carter and the Carter family, which was basically her daughters at that point, in that year in 49. And then he becomes an official member of the Opry in his own right, not just as a backing guitarist for other people. And he's, this highly skilled, eclectic guitarist that's drawing on jazz, on pop sounds, on old ragtime tunes. He's playing old folk tunes. He has this huge repertoire. He plays classical guitar on some albums and gigs. This wide-ranging repertoire, and really just a true guitar hero in that sense. He also really becomes the sound of country, that smooth, clean sound. And here you see him in the studio. His first hit as a solo guitarist was in 54 with Mr. Sandman. And it's a really interesting, complicated arrangement. He shifts keys, he modulates in the middle. He starts off with basically just some drums and bass, but it's mostly just him on finger-picking, kind of classically inspired guitar. And then he moves into this more country-oriented solo. It's really something. In 57, he's put in charge of RCA Victor's Nashville division, and he produced many of the big names in country from this time. Hank Snow, Dolly Parton. He basically discovers Dolly Parton and really promotes her career. He doesn't literally discover her, as we'll see. That honor goes to a different gentleman, but he really pushes her as a solo artist. Floyd Kramer, the great pianist, he's integral in the development of Elvis Presley and that sound. The Everly Brothers, Eddie Arnold, whom we have already mentioned, and Jim Reeves. So the latter part of their careers were really cultivated by Chet Atkins. He also helped give Waylon Jennings his start. So he's very involved with some of the big names in country music, and then a lot of the names that are forgotten now. But that Nashville sound, he's really one of the architects of it, along with Steve Scholes and a handful of other people. One of the people that Atkins is involved with is this gentleman. This is Hank Snow. This is an incredibly prolific performer. 140 albums and over 85 charting singles, and he wrote many of his own hits, so he's a performer and a composer. October of 1936, he auditions for the Canadian division of RCA Victor, and he remained with Victor for the remainder of his life. In 1949, he moves to Nashville, which is, by that point is becoming the capital of country music. His first U.S. release was Marriage Vow, and it made the number 10 spot on the country charts. He joins the Opry in 1950 and releases I'm Moving On, and that's one of his first big hits. It's a number one hit, first of 7. And I'm Moving On is kind of a country standard. A lot of people have played it, and his version, of course, is very famous. The song stayed at number 1 for 21 weeks, and he was tied with Eddie Arnold and Webb Pierce for the longest stay at the top of the country charts, an unbroken record until 2013, when the Florida Georgia Line beat them all by staying at the top of the charts with the song Cruise, and that's one of the bro country songs, and we'll talk about that next semester. Other number ones of that year by Hank Snow, included Roomba Boogie. So notice this use of both the Latin style, the rumba, and then sort of a boogie woogie sound, and then the Golden Rocket. He was instrumental in getting Elvis on the Grand Ole Opry. He also used Elvis as an opening act for one of his tours, and he introduced Elvis to Elvis's famous manager, Colonel Tom Parker. And we'll talk about him in a coming session. At first, Hank Snow and Colonel Tom Parker are business partners. They have a management company, but Hank Snow was a very encouraging, a very sort of respectful and demure gentleman, and Colonel Parker was kind of a mean and self-involved, self-important businessman. He wasn't a colonel of any sort. That's a name he gave himself. And eventually Hank Snow got a little fed up with Colonel Tom Parker, and they had a falling out, and he kind of blamed himself for some of what he saw as the abuses that Elvis suffered under Colonel Tom Parker, but we'll talk about that soon. In 1962, he releases I've Been Everywhere, and this becomes his signature song. And I only mention this. He's important, of course, for us in the 50s, and obviously 1962 is beyond the parameters of this semester, but I'm not going to bring him up again next semester, and that was a big hit for him. It becomes the signature song of the rest of his career, and it's also a showpiece for singers working on fast auctioneer-like delivery. So a lot of singers wind up performing this piece. He sounds almost like he's an auctioneer. He's just rattling off the words one after another very quickly. Of course, one of the most celebrated singers of the Nashville sound is this one, Patsy Cline. She's one of the most influential vocalists and one of the first crossover artists from country to pop, as opposed to the other way around. It was much more typical of a crossover from pop to country than country to pop, like we saw with Patti Page, like we saw with Bing Crosby. But this idea of crossing in the other direction was a little more rare. She began singing on WNC in Virginia, and when she was only 15 years old. By 1954, she had a contract with the 4-Star label and a minor success with a pretty interesting song from 55 called A Church, a Courtroom, and Goodbye. And then after that in 56 with I've Loved and Lost Again. I'm pretty interested in the song Church, Courtroom, and Goodbye, and that would be worth listening to if you make the time. In 1957, she appears on TV on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, and she sings the song Walking After Midnight, and this becomes her first crossover hit, in part because of her TV presence. That performance was very celebrated in the press and so on. In 1958, she moves to Nashville, of course, the center of country music, and begins working with manager Randy Hughes and producer Owen Bradley, who's another of the architects of the Nashville sound, at Decca. And she's recording at Decca by 1960. In 1961, she releases I Fall to Pieces, and then, of course, Crazy that same year. And those are both huge hits, and Crazy is kind of her signature hit. Again, we're talking about the 60s, and I will return to her a little bit next semester. But her first hits were in the late 50s, and she's an important part of the Nashville sound, so worth mentioning now. She unfortunately dies in a plane crash in 1963, so still at the very beginnings in a lot of ways of her career. So that's it for this time, and I'll see you for the next session.